The world's a crazy place. It's been a year since Russia invaded Ukraine, the US is shooting down Chinese balloons, and there's still a fat man with nukes in North Korea. With such complicated events occurring on what feels like a weekly basis, how can we make sense of everything and make rational decisions in response? Well, lucky for us, a bunch of smart people wondered this too, and put together theories to understand geopolitics. There are many schools of thought in international relations, but I want to focus on the main three that have really shaped our view of global affairs: realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Before jumping into them, I want to preface that these theories are expansive and have their own subdisciplines, so I'm just giving a broad overview. Realism is concerned with understanding the struggle for power and security among states in an anarchic international system. By anarchic international system, we are referring to the absence of a world government to arbitrate disagreements among nation-states and enforce peace. This idea of anarchy goes back to 17th century philosopher Thomas Hale's conception of the state of nature, a hypothetical account of humankind in its most primitive form, where no central authority exists to establish and enforce rules among individuals. Hobbes explained that the lack of a sovereign power left individuals in a continual fear and danger of violent death, and characterizes human nature as self-interested and brutish. Under such conditions, it was up to the individual to provide their own security. Realists translate Hobbes' concepts onto the international level by replacing individuals with states and replacing the state of nature with the international system. The most influential contributor to realism, John Mearsheimer, argued that this led to several assumptions of state behavior. First, states are the principal actors on the international stage. So non-state actors like NGOs, IGOs, special interest groups, and even individuals do not matter for realists. People are also greedy, insecure, and aggressive, so it's only natural that the states they govern will have those same characteristics. This sets up states to be exclusively concerned with its own survival under an anarchic international system, just as humankind is in the state of nature. Second, realists also view states as unitary actors, meaning that states may have underlying domestic disagreements and policy struggles, however they eventually unite under a single foreign policy decision. Third, states are rational actors in that decision-making ends with the pursuit of national interests while engaging in actions that would weaken the state is irrational. Simply put, states try to maximize gains and minimize losses. Finally, every nation wields some military capability, and no state can confidently know another country's intentions. You can think of it like the fog of war in video games, where you're aware that your enemy is building their military capacities, but you're unsure of how they're doing so and how they plan to use it. With these assumptions of state behavior in mind, realists understand interactions between states in terms of the distribution of power, meaning that the only factor in determining a state's behavior is its relative power. State motivations, regime type, and ideology all do not matter, since realists believe all states will act the same on the basis of where they lie in the distribution of power. Simply put, it's the relative power of states that determines state behavior, which influences the overall stability of the system. So then what's the most stable distribution of power? Well, we have three models to choose from. Unipolarity, or when a single nation enjoys unchallenged power over global affairs. Bipolarity, or when two nations or alliance systems roughly match each other's global influence. And multipolarity, or when at least three nations or alliance systems match each other in global influence. Realists debate on which model is most stable. Starting with hegemonic stability theory, it stipulates that the international system is most stable when there is a dominant unipolar power, such as in the cases of Pax Romana, Pax Britannica, and even today's Pax Americana. According to the theory, conflict occurs when a rising power and declining hegemon reach similar power levels. At the same time, the Cold War was a bipolar system with NATO on one side and the Warsaw Pact on another, and that never turned into a direct armed conflict. Kenneth Waltz argued this was the case because the US and USSR engaged in rapid mutual military adjustment, which prevented inadvertent escalation and reduced power asymmetries. You can think of mutually assured destruction as an example. Hans Morgenthau argued that multipolar systems are most stable since nations would indirectly challenge each other through alliances and petty wars. The Concert of Europe is seen as an example of stability under multipolarity, while World War II is an example of war arising from it. So essentially, everyone is right and everyone is wrong. This constant struggle of power balancing creates a security dilemma, aka the reciprocal response of other nations to another's increase in military power. This leads to an arms race and growing tensions, which naturally ends in conflict. So all of this makes realism great for explaining conflict and understanding international decision-making in the context of national survival. While it's a good tool for the conflictual side of international affairs, if foreign policy leaders purely look at global politics through the realist lens, then we definitely see more conflict, simply because its framework inherently views the international system as conflictual. Realism is also pretty simplistic. I mean, you've got just a few assumptions about states that pretty much dictate their behavior and how the international system works. It's also a bit naive to think states are the only actors on the international stage. IGOs like the UN and WTO, NGOs like the Human Rights Watch, terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, and national leaders all obviously play some role in shaping international affairs. Realism also understands changes in power to only occur through war, and has a hard time explaining peaceful transitions of power, like at the end of the Cold War. Another issue with realism, and largely theory as a whole, is that it's static in nature, meaning that it's not flexible in scope. It has a fixed framework and understanding of the world that is used to evaluate a variety of international events. This makes realism a one-size-fits-all theory. However, international events are obviously way more complicated than that. So what if you have a more optimistic view of human nature and the international system? Well, liberalism's got you. I probably don't have to mention this, but by liberalism, I'm not talking about left versus right or Democrat versus Republican politics. I'm referring to the school of thought that democracy is based on. Like realism, liberalism evolved from an older, more domestic-facing political theory and draws much of its influence from John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire. Liberalism in international relations is consistent with classical liberalism's central idea that the state's goal is to safeguard individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise. Liberals also believe humankind is more than just conflict and self-interest. Given the correct tools, like institutions that equally distribute power, the rule of law, and other democratic mechanisms, individuals can band together in the pursuit of a common good. Now throw some globalization in there, and you bring liberalism to the international stage. Let me explain. Liberals believe international politics starts with individuals, who then assign themselves to political groups that appeal their social and political preferences to the state. And since liberals believe the fundamental force driving international politics is globalization, or the growing interdependence between nations, those political groups will lobby their governments to regulate globalization in different ways. Political scientist Andrew Moravchik puts it in a pretty simple way. Individuals and private groups are the fundamental actors in world politics. States represent some dominant subset of domestic society whose interests they serve, and the configuration of these preferences across the international system determines state behavior. Liberalism's focus on social preferences is a drastic departure from realism, which argues each state has the same goals and behaviors according to the distribution of power. As such, liberals argue that conflict arises from the distribution of state preferences. In other words, nations that have diverging political, economic, religious, or social interests are more likely to engage in conflict. However, liberals do not believe the international system is inherently conflictual, and when the distribution of state preferences line up, there is room for diplomatic cooperation and economic interdependence. The most prominent example of this is democratic peace theory, which stipulates that democratic nations will not attack each other because they are characterized by internal restraints on power, like the rule of law and legislative oversight. Second, democracies tend to see each other as legitimate and unthreatening, and therefore have a higher capacity for cooperation. I think it's pretty apparent by now, but liberals prefer cooperation over conflict for a couple of reasons. First, liberals believe mutual cooperation produces absolute gains for all versus relative gains for the victor. Realists view international relations as a zero-sum game where there is a victor and a loser. Liberals instead argue that each party can both walk away better if they coordinate political and economic aspirations together. Second, liberals want to avoid conflict altogether since the military power needed to wage war can also be used to oppress the citizenry and subvert liberal democratic principles. So then how do liberals encourage cooperation and discourage conflict? Well, we currently live in a liberal world order, so let's examine that. Our current world order is built on international government organizations, international law, international norms, and the proliferation of capitalism and liberal democracy. And you can thank those freedom-loving Americans for that. International norms and law go hand in hand. Liberal democratic principles like cooperation, human rights, and the rule of law are embedded in nearly all aspects of global affairs. We actively discourage wars and praise cooperation. And when a state takes actions contrary to these norms, they are subject to various types of repercussions. Depending on the situation, those repercussions can vary from economic and political sanctions all the way to a multilateral military intervention. We can also look at human rights violations, which are obviously illegal under international law. Individuals behind such atrocities can be brought to law at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Liberals believe a good way to ensure nations adhere to international norms and law is by exporting democracy and capitalism. We already touched on how democracy does so with democratic peace theory, but economics is also a major part for liberals. As countries embrace free trade capitalism, they become economically interdependent and integrated, and produce absolute gains. Countries are less likely to engage in military conflict since they do not want to rupture the resulting economic growth and relationships, and instead rely on diplomatic solutions in disagreements. The idea is that economic integration makes it not worth it for nations to go to war. Golden Arches theory is a fun attempt at demonstrating this. It basically argues that countries with McDonald's operating inside of them will not go to war with each other since they are part of the same global supply chain and do not want the economic damage of rupturing that relationship. Now obviously there are events that disprove it, like the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but it does demonstrate how an interconnected economy is a factor in spreading international cooperation. Finally, and arguably most important, liberals believe IGOs are essential for facilitating international cooperation since they are basically platforms that encourage sovereign nations to do so. IGOs evenly distribute power, or at least try to, across all nations with the aim of pooling resources to achieve common goals and produce an absolute gain for all nations involved. IGOs are also integral in upholding democratic norms, enforcing international law, and spreading democracy and free trade capitalism. The International Court of Justice, the UN, the WTO, and the IMF are all IGOs that do these things in their own respective ways. For example, the UN may sanction nations engaging in aggressive actions, or the IMF may provide loans to developing nations if they make democratic reforms and implement policies that support free trade. So all of this makes liberalism great for understanding where cooperation is possible and how it may arise in the international system. It's also a good framework to understand how globalization is changing international affairs since economics is a major component of the theory. However, it has a hard time explaining conflict in areas where realism does it well, and it really does question the existential validity of liberalism. Like, can we really believe that national characteristics like democracy and free trade really matter to a nation when its very existence is at threat? Doesn't it make more sense that states fall back on national security as its main goal when it really comes down to it? I mean, just look at the Japanese internment camps of World War II. The US suspended civil rights in order to protect its national security from what it perceived as a threat. Again, we see a theory that cannot account for all aspects of global affairs. Our final theory, Constructivism, is drastically different in its historical development and structure to liberalism and realism. It's like a first-year art student who feels all high and mighty when they say art is subjective, because that's pretty much what the theory argues. Constructivism did not spawn from centuries of intellectual thought and is a relatively recent development coming out of the Cold War. Nicholas Onuf is credited with coining the term constructivism, referring to the conception of international relations as a social construct. Alexander Wendt explains this very well with his famous quote, "Anarchy is what states make of it," meaning that international relations can be interpreted different ways by countries, leading to different actions. With that in mind, let's take a look at Wendt's example of the social construction of reality on the international stage. 500 British nuclear weapons are less threatening to the United States than 5 North Korean weapons. This is because constructivists are not solely evaluating the material structure of the situation, i.e. the nuclear weapons, but are considering the ideational structure of the situation itself, specifically the United States' respective relationships with the United Kingdom and North Korea. We can better define material structure as the real, tangible, physical facts, and ideational structure as the combination of beliefs, norms, and national identities that form social context. The example demonstrates that the nuclear weapons alone do not have much meaning to a state unless we attach some sort of social context to it. So then how do countries form ideational structures and apply social context to the international system? Let's begin with the concepts of agency, which can be understood as the ability of someone or some nation to act, and structure, which refers to the combination of material and ideational elements. We can see this in the nuclear weapons example. The hostile relations between the United States and North Korea is the shared ideational structure of the situation. The only actors that can change this relationship are the agents themselves, the United States and North Korea. Whether the relationship changes or is reinforced depends on the beliefs and ideas each state holds. If those beliefs change, then the social relationship, aka the structure, changes. This leads to a major departure between constructivism in respect to realism and liberalism. Constructivists recognize that reality is always under construction. Ideational meanings assigned to the material structure are not fixed like the previous theories, and can change over time depending on the ideas and beliefs actors hold. National identities and interests also play a central role in developing ideational structures. Constructivists argue that states have multiple identities that are constructed through their interactions with other states. For example, the identity of a small state implies that there are a set of interests that make it distinct from the identity of a large state. A small state is arguably more concerned about its survival, while a large country is focused on growing its regional or global influence. A state cannot act contrary to its identity because this will call into question the identity's validity. This might explain why Germany, which is a leading global economic power, did not become a military power in the second half of the 20th century, despite its extensive military history. The atrocities of the Nazi regime profoundly changed the German political identity from one of militarism to that of pacifism. Constructivism's strengths are largely what sets it apart from traditional theories like realism and liberalism. It is the most flexible theory out of the three by a long shot. We see this flexibility in how ideational structures are able to evolve as a result of changes in national identities, norms, and beliefs. This allows us to account for variations in state behavior and better understand international affairs beyond the conflict-cooperation dichotomy. Constructivism also considers non-state actors important in the international system since they have the ability to influence national identities and beliefs, unlike liberalism and realism who view the state as the primary international actor. This flexibility also limits constructivism. Since reality is always under construction, the theory cannot predict future behavior and can only be used to analyze past events. Additionally, if anarchy is really what states make of it, as Alexander Wendt leads us to believe, then what if states really do believe the world is inherently conflictual? I mean, humans are capable of some pretty gnarly stuff, and history doesn't really present us with a good track record. But at the same time, maybe we are changing that with IGOs and more international cooperation than ever. So those are the main theories of international relations that pretty much every first-year political science student is going to learn. I wanted to give a brief overview of them since if I were to go into all the different mechanisms and sub-theories within each of them, we'd be here all day. There are also many other schools of thought that take on wildly different conceptions of global affairs, so maybe sometime in the future we can tackle those. Anyways, thanks for watching.